Back in the year 2006, I got a great honor. My cousin asked me to come down to San Antonio and perform his wedding. And I was excited to go to San Antonio because I'm a Texan. I grew up hearing all the stories of the Alamo. I had been as a kid. Just tell me if you're like me, if you grew up in Texas. I think probably I could have named 5 of the Alamo defenders earlier in my life than I could have told you the first 5 U.S. presidents. I went to Crockett Elementary. This is how this goes, okay? So I was excited because I'd been as a kid, but now I'm going to go as an adult, and this time I get to take my wife, who's from Oklahoma. She's going to get to see this. She's heard all these stories. So we go to San Antonio. We're there in the evening, and we park on like the east side of the River Center Mall. We walk through there, through the shops, and we're heading out the northwest corner across Crockett Street, rounding, and I'm so excited. And we round the corner, and, there it is. And she said, "Is that a replica? Is that the thing?" Oh! Now, you've seen what it looks like. Here's a satellite photo. She's kind of got a point. It's been dwarfed by all these buildings. It's like, well, at the time, here's like a Ripley's Believe It or Not across the street. There's some guy in his underwear riding a unicycle around with a protest sign. I don't know. You know what it's like if you've been there. Don't hate on my wife if you're a Texan. I got that permission to tell that story. It was difficult for me because we built it up so much. And you Texans know we do build it up a lot. But those memorial markers, those important places, they mean something to us. And wherever you're from, you have things like that, these markers, these memorials, these places that tell a story about important times in history. It's a story that's meaningful to you in some way or another. This week in our series on holy ground, as we look at different places in Scripture and the meanings behind it, we find ourselves on the east side of the Jordan River. And here's where we are in history. Moses has spent 40 years leading the people around, got them out of Egypt by the hand of the Lord, and wandered through the desert with God's faithful hand upon them. And now they're on one side of the river, and they need to cross in order to get to the land that God has promised them. And so they send the spies over. This is early in the book of Joshua. We go scout the land. They meet Rahab. They determine that God's hand is with them and that they can go and take this new land. So Joshua tells the people, break camp. We're going to travel right to the banks of the river and sit there for 3 days. And then it's time to cross. And Joshua has instructions for the people. First is that the priest will carry the Ark of the Covenant into the river, and the moment they step into the river, the waters will dry up. And this is at flood stage, mind you. They dry up, and then all the people will march across while the priests stand in the middle of the river with the Ark of the Covenant. And so this happens. The people march across on dry ground just like they had done a generation ago, crossing the Red Sea, kind of a bookend moment in God getting them from slavery in Egypt to this new promised land. But before they finish crossing, Joshua has one more thing for them to do. He calls one man from each of the 12 tribes, and he gives them these instructions in Joshua chapter 4. Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. In fact, later on, the book tells us that they are there to this day, which tells you the timeline of when this was written. You wouldn't say that if it was just next week. They've been there a while as of the time of this writing. So before they finish crossing, you get 12 men who represent each of the 12 tribes. They go in, they grab a stone, and they bring it to the west side. and they make a memorial. And the reason for that is this: when your children ask you, and you know the children will ask. When they ask, you have something to point to. This is a memorial marker to the work of God. In fact, it's so important that Joshua repeats it a few verses later with some different flavoring to it. He says, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? You tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us. Notice the us language. Many of them weren't around for that, but they're us. Until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. See, Joshua knows this: memory fades. And if you don't keep it alive, the story will not be told. So now he doesn't just say, when your children ask, he says, when your descendants ask their parents. This is a multi-generational marker. Many will follow, many will ask. And so these stones are intended to be seen by multiple generations. And the kids who see this pile of stones will ask, what's going on with that? What's up with this pile of rocks, Dad? What's up with this pile of rocks, Grandma? And now, the older generations will have a way to tell this story. They'll have this entry point because kids will see and kids will ask, and they can say, this is when God pulled back the Jordan River, just like he did the Red Sea, to get us to safety, to get us to where we are now. And because of that, kids, you should know God's power and fear him. There is something to be said in this story for the role of the older generations, for the role specifically, but not limited to, the grandparents. Let me just tell you that one of my favorite things in life is watching friends and colleagues become grandparents. I've gotten to watch two colleagues in the past year or two, Rita and Jim, become grandparents, and that's been a delight. I'll also tell you that as a minister, I have not seen anything as powerful as grandkids to effect life change in grandparents. I've seen people quit jobs, retire, move across the country, act foolish. They will do anything for these grandkids. One of the most moving moments at funerals is when grandkids will get up and talk, because their perspective is so important and it's so meaningful, how they talk about the simple things, the way their grandparents were with them. Yesterday, I was in Oklahoma City for the day at the funeral of a dear friend and mentor of mine, Bailey McBride. Bailey was a longtime teacher at Oklahoma Christian University, editor of the Christian Chronicle, elder at the Memorial Road Church for many years. Bailey is the reason I got back into ministry in 2008 after deciding I would never do that again. He is a pivotal figure in my life. And so I went up to the campus of Oklahoma Christian where they honored him in a ceremony. And part of that ceremony was a few of his grandkids getting up to speak. And they could just barely contain their emotions. And then they played a recording of Bailey. It's an audio recording he had sent to one of his great-grandkids. I think the setting was this great-grandchild was about to go off to camp. And so they were inviting family members to kind of speak blessings and encouragement over him. And so for the first time in a while, I heard his voice played over the speakers as he reminded his great-grandson to pay attention to the faithfulness of God. And Bailey could tell stories about God's faithfulness. Faithfulness through many moves to complete his academic career. Faithfulness through a bout with cancer. Faithfulness through the loss of his first wife after decades of being married together. Bailey could tell those stories to his kids and his grandkids and his great-grandkids and to all of us who knew him and loved him. See, grandparents have the patience to tell stories and answer questions that the parents don't. Grandparents know why the sky is blue. Grandparents know why Uncle Jimmy always sits alone at Thanksgiving, and they'll tell you. Grandparents will tell you why your parents are the way they are. They know the answer to these stories. They also can tell stories of God's faithfulness throughout multiple generations. Grandparents know about God's faithfulness through illness and job loss and betrayal and aging. Grandparents carry the echoes of answered prayers and remember how faith got them through lean years and lost dreams. They are walking archives of God's patience, and they are the keepers of covenant memory. They're the ones who don't just remember what God did, they can tell it and show it and pass it on. This isn't just limited to grandparents, but any figures who are in a place to tell God's story to younger generations. My question to you this morning is, what stories are you telling? And do they have anything to do with the faithfulness of God? You may not have a crossing the Jordan story. Maybe you have photos in your home that aren't immediately obvious that they are about God's faithfulness. But you look at those photos and you can say, you know, that was the year things finally got better. That family photo was after the Lord saw us through a very difficult illness. That photo was the last good year we had for a while after hard times. But God was faithful with the joy we held that year. Are there mementos around your house that you can use to tell a story just with some creativity? It's not always obvious when you look at those things that there's a story behind them. But if you think hard enough, you can tell a story of God's faithfulness using simple markers and photos and mementos around your house. Or maybe it's around town and there are places that are meaningful to you as you show them to other generations. A couple of years ago, my grandmother was getting ready to move from her hometown. It was time for her to receive a different level of care and be closer to some other family members. And so I went and drove her around this town she lived almost her whole life. And I put a little audio recorder on and we took some photos. And she drove me around to the different houses she'd grown up in and the places she had worked. And she told me some of her story, and then we began to talk about my grandfather. He'd passed away in 2008, and I said, well, show me some of the important homes to him. And she said, well, that's difficult to do because he had so many, and there were days he wasn't sure if the rent house they were in would be where they were in the next month, just because he'd had a different style of parents. And I learned that day about my grandfather and why he was the way he was. Because after his experience growing up, he was one of those people whose life narrative was, I will not be like that with my family. I will put a roof over their heads, I will keep them secure, and I will show them what it is like to be faithful to God. That was his story. I never heard it put that way, but it made so much sense. He used his story and those different markers around town to say, with me, it will be different. That's a story that he told. It has shaped me. It has shaped my mom and her siblings. It has shaped my cousins, and we never put it that way until my grandmother told me that story. All these things, the photos, the places around town, the stories that we tell are acts of protest against a world that rewards amnesia. Our world rewards the newest and latest and greatest. And against that, we say, no, these things mattered. These stones and these scars and these street corners are sacred signs that God was here. So our culture may tear down and make room but our memory builds altars. We may be trained to update and upgrade and not remember, but Joshua says, don't you dare move forward until you have marked what God has done. If we fast forward 300 years from this story of crossing the Jordan, and we find ourselves at Gilgal again, we find a new ruler of Israel faced with the temptation to forget. It's King Saul, and he's camped out with his troops at Gilgal. That's where the stones were, on the west side of the river. He's supposed to wait for Samuel the prophet. Samuel's the one who anointed him and kind of helped him become king, and Samuel says, wait for me, don't do anything. But after several days, Saul grows impatient, and he decides he should do this on his own. So he makes a sacrifice that he wasn't supposed to make. And then Samuel shows up, and he says, you weren't supposed to do that. You forgot God's faithfulness. You got impatient. And all this happens in the same vicinity of these stones that were set up to say, do not forget God. So Saul remembered the ritual but forgot the obedience. He stood on sacred ground, but he missed the story it was telling. The ground remembered and the stones remembered, but Saul didn't. A few years ago in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I had an opportunity to return to San Antonio. My brother, who's a choir director, was directing his choir that was at the State Educators Music Convention. It's a big deal to get invited to that, so we all came down to watch. But I'd done a little more research this time. I was ready, because I knew there was more than that chapel that we saw. So my whole family was eating lunch at the River Center Mall, and I just decided to sneak away for a little bit. And I went across the street, south this time, across Commerce Street, because there was a marker there I wanted to see. The marker reads this way: on this spot, bodies of heroes slain at the Alamo were burned on funeral pyres. That marker was put there by a woman named Adina de Zavala in 1918. And originally it was on the side of something called the Half building. It doesn't exist anymore. But at some point, the building was torn down. That marker was moved, and they put a marker about the marker next to it to say this is where this happened. See, I knew there was so much more in that city that told the story of this important event. And this small act by an ordinary woman kept these memories alive. It's more than just the chapel that still stands. All over the city of San Antonio, there are markers to the bravery and courage of those Alamo defenders. They're not flashy. They don't trend anywhere, but they tell a story. And like the stones at Gilgal, they say to all those who pass by, don't you forget. So what's your stone? What's your marker? What's the story you're telling? And I hope that at least some of those stories you tell are about the faithfulness of our God.